Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bedlock Gamer, and we're back with an update to the tier list. I've also changed my mic setup. I actually have, I got a new shock mount so I could adjust my mic. So I've actually my mic over here rather than, like down in the corner like I used to, or like kind of in front of me. So we'll see how the audio does this time around. And, if need be, I'll make some more changes, but hopefully this allows it because I always tend to like move to the right. So at least when I'm looking to the right, I'm now talking into the mic and it's a little bit more out of my way so I can have my mic up here more easily. So, we'll see how it works. But anyway, tier lists. We're here. We're now doing E through F or updating the A through F. And there's only 10, which is really good for me because that means I don't have to sit here for 2 hours and record. I would have added G, but there's actually a fair amount of G. There's actually like 12, 13 G named archetypes, which is very weird. And there's a fair amount of H's as well. So we'll probably do, G through H next time as well. And that will probably be the end of the 2-letter tier list. And there'll probably be more letters after that. But who knows? Who knows what they'll add? But anyway, so hopefully at this point you're familiar with the series, but if not, if you're just here to see the end goal, then let me go ahead and explain again kind of how I do this. So I rate each of the archetypes based on 3 metrics. I rate it on its availability, how many classes would want to take this archetype, and, like how good is the archetype. Functionality, which is how well the archetype does what it sets out to do. So while some archetypes are more based on combat and others are more on exploration, some are even more narratively based, I rate on what it's setting out to do and, how well it provides that function for you so that if you pick it up, you're getting what you're putting into, more or less. And finally, it's fantasy fulfillment, where I rate it on, does it add anything to your character? Is this something that you can drop on your character that really enhances the experience for your character, or is it just like a mechanical thing that's added on top of it? So flair and some of the features I think I really take into consideration when it comes to that. I rate each of these metrics based on, S through D, or 1 to 5 points. I guess inverse that. So, S being 5 points and D being 1 point. You know what I mean. And then I kind of tally it all up. And more or less, whatever the averages are. So, for instance, 1 through 3 is D. 2 through 6 is C. 7 through 9 is B. 10 through 12 is A. And 13 to 15 is S. So as long as it does pretty well in one of the metrics and then just under in the other 2 metrics, I'll push some of them up above. But, obviously, and I feel like I shouldn't have to mention this, but I'm going to anyway, this is me trying to be objective. This is not really my opinions personally on how I try to look at these things very, unbiasedly, but still some of it is purely my opinion and it's just unavoidable. Your list might be different, and how you weight these different metrics might be different for you. So if your tier list would look different than mine, that's completely normal. This is just a very unbiased, as objective as possible list as I can possibly make. You can be the judges afterwards. But let's go ahead and actually get into it, shall we? All right, so first up on the list is going to be the Edgewatch Detective. It's based on the module, so it's very particular to that module. Essentially, what the Edgewatch Detective does is you are, a detective. You become trained in society and thievery, and if you are trained in these already, you would get additional skill traits. So it doesn't even get you to expert in anything necessarily. It lets you use perception instead of survival to track, which can be good. It removes a possible extra skill that you would need. Not a super big thing. You also gain the experience tracker skill feat, which is good. So overall, 2 skills up to train proficiency plus experience tracker, and you can substitute perception for tracking perception for survival when you track. It's okay. Other things, as Seek Alignment, I mentioned in the video, I'm not a big fan of Seek Alignment, and honestly, the metrics for it are not super great. Actually, you know what? This isn't a review, so I don't need to go into a review. Let's just talk about the metrics, shall we? So, availability. Edgewatch Detective is... It's got 2 stat requirements. So it's got... You need an intelligence of 14 and a wisdom of 14. That's pretty high, honestly, for 2 mental-based stats. That's a lot that a lot of martial characters might be hesitant to make the investment for. Oh, I'm sorry, it's or. Okay, I missed the or. So 14 intelligence or 14 wisdom. Not so bad. That definitely changes my opinion a little bit. It's okay. I mean, having a 14 is some stat investment for sure for some classes. So just based on that metric alone, I would rate it maybe like an A or a B. Probably a B, because stats are just something that players are very hesitant to, invest when it's only for like something. So unless you have a need, because also intelligence nor wisdom are really used in combat, besides wisdom attributing to perception, which can attribute to your initiative, but that doesn't always have to be the case with how initiative works in Pathfinder 2e. So that being the case, and what the function is it's based on being a detective with some detective-like ability. It's a lot of sensory abilities, really, with 1 in 10 interrogation. So how many characters would pick it, I think, limits it even further. So due to the stat investment and due to the type of character this would, apply to or anything with these very particular skills, I'll mark it a strong C. It's okay. If this is the kind of character you're building, obviously you're going to want your wisdom or intelligence higher anyway. So that's not so much a big deal. But due to like what it provides and what I think players, how many players would seek it versus not, it really is a very niche style archetype for sure. So I'm going to give it a C as far as its availability. As far as function, it does the job. I think that like sense alignment is a feat that works really only at high levels because of how the aura system works. I mentioned that in the video when I was talking about it. Arcane sensitivity is another good one, but it's not a skill feat. It's just an archetype feat. So that's, I mean, you can get almost the same thing with a skill feat, which I feel is better. So that's already not great. And then Bolera's interrogation is interesting for sure. It essentially gives you like detect lies or like zone of truth kind of 3 times per day, which is really solid. But it's very particular. It's only used in very niche situations. And I think overall, unfortunately for the Edgewatch Detective, it's just super niche. There's not a lot of feats to really invest in when it comes to what you're looking for. And, it's something that I feel like, while the feats are good and could be helpful, investing 3 whole feats into this particular archetype just so you could do another archetype, especially if you're using the bonus archetype rule, I feel would be very painful. So I think overall, for functionality, I'm going to give it a C as well. And actually, I'm going to change my earlier score. I'm going to change availability to B. If it's what you want to do, no, I'll make it C as well. So it's 2 C's already. Not looking good. How about its fantasy fulfillment? Well, in all honesty, it doesn't really offer a lot. I do like how sense alignment can play into it. Your character just has an innate sense of good or bad, right or evil, good or evil kind of situation. Arcane sensitivity and Belora's interrogation. I think with all these things mixed in, you get a very decent flavor for your character. Your character is really good at seeking the truth, and it has like the ability and senses that go with it. It's not a very deep archetype, but I think overall what it's trying to do is it can work for your character's narrative. And even if the feats don't play into a lot of what you do, what you can do, what your character is capable of, can play into the fantasy that goes into it. So that being the case, I'll actually give the Edgewatch Detectives Fantasy Fulfillment a B. So with 2 C's, that's 4 points, and a B, which is a total of 7 points. That puts it just above C rank and into B rank, which, I would put it bottom of B for sure. When I look at it next to Bullet Dancer and Corpse Tender, it definitely hasn't sunken that low. Is it as good as, like, say, Aldori Duelist? No, I don't think so. I might have spelled Duelist here wrong, actually. Did I misspell Duelist here? I think I said this last time, too. I did. Oh, well. You'll have to forgive me. But anyway, I I don't think it's as bad as Bullet Dancer. I think Bullet Dancer is like the barrier, right? If it's as bad or worse than Bullet Dancer, it drops to C. Edgewatch Detective is like the bare bottom though of B. I think it's like it gatekeeps anything below it. Anything that needs to be a B needs to at least be better than Edgewatch Detective, which I think is 100% fair. All right, next up is Eldritch Archer. This is a really good one, and you know what? Let me go ahead and just look it over. Yeah, the only thing required for Eldritch Archer is to be expert in at least one type of bow. Now, as someone did mention in one of my videos, expert in bow is a little bit hard for, say, spellcasters and such, as they don't become expert in anything until at least like level 11. With that in mind, Eldritch Archer very much focuses on martials. And in most campaigns, even if you were a spellcaster who was looking to get into this, which is completely possible, it's a late game investment. So while it is possible, I will say that just due to that alone, this is predominantly a more martial based archetype, and I'll give it a B ranking as far as availability is concerned, purely only just for the fact that you need to be expert in bow, one type of bow, and that can be somewhat difficult. There might be some other archetypes you might work together to get into it, which I think is completely possible. But even then, most archetypes don't give you expert. They let them upgrade with your other weapon proficiencies. I do think there are simple bows, though, so I do think there's actually a lot of classes that could get access to this eventually, just like level 11, 12, 13, which is a long time to wait to get into an archetype. So unfortunately, I'm going to mark this B just as a very basic, mostly martial based archetype. All right, so let's talk about functionality. Obviously, Eldritch Archer is predominantly a combat-based archetype. There's no doubting that. It's very focused on its combat abilities, and it gives you a lot of really cool arrows, a lot of cool shots. I think mechanically it blends in really well with the playstyle of, using a bow, and I do think Eldritch Archer is pretty S tier as far as what it sets out to do. It gives you a lot of good martial abilities to add to your combat. You get a lot of free actions. For instance, Magic Arrow allows you to just produce magical ammunition of 4th level or lower. And while a lot of those are tied to really low DCs that might not be helpful, obviously as more books come out and more ammunitions could be added at that level that don't have DCs, I think it has a lot of opportunity to, give you a lot more. And kind of on top of that, a lot of these kind of act more like as metamagics, but metamagics, for instance, to a melee attack. So rather than like a metamagic for a 2-action spell, they're a metamagic that kind of affect a 1-action strike. Precious Arrow is a good example of you enchant your arrow and it becomes either cold iron or silver. And at 14th level, it can become adamantine. As an additional action on top of that, and allowing your arrows to affect enemies that they might struggle with before, or affect them even better, all super good. Mechanically speaking, it looks really well. A lot of these actions are also just either 1-action kind of metamagic effects, or you get full action like Arrow of Death, where you create a giant zone area that does 10d10 precision damage. Really good. Impossible Volley is level 20 feet. And also to mention as well, this is an archetype that's kind of in the prestige class kind of air, where you can take this at level 6 is the minimum level. But you can take this from level 6 to end game real easy, investing in it, especially with bonus archetype feats, and I think you get a lot out of it. So definitely Eldritch Archer has an S as far as its functionality. All right, and last but not least, it's fantasy fulfillment. Well, it doesn't have a lot of non-combat related stuff, so it doesn't give you an all-round as far as like feel, but in combat you feel really good. And with how some arrows would work and some of the abilities you can do, there might even be some good outside of combat ability uses for the arrows, allowing your kind of trick arrow nature to play into other aspects of the game just beyond the combat. I don't think I can give it an S. I think that it's so focused on combat and other smaller niche situations that it doesn't play into your character, like it doesn't play into your character's aesthetic unless you're in combat typically. I do think it's a strong A though, which is really good overall. I think it could be argued it could be S because obviously in combat, this can change your entire class. This can change the aesthetic of your entire class, which is really good. I just, because it's so combat orientated, I don't think I can give it an all round tier score like S, where, well, yeah, because I don't think I gave its fantasy fulfillment to Archer an S as well. You know what? Let me double check. Yeah, pretty much what I thought. I gave Archer a rank in its fantasy fulfillment as well. Even though you do become the Eldritch Archer, it's just in combat really, and it doesn't really apply outside of that. So I can't rate it the same as far as like other fantasy fulfillments can be, but still, Eldritch Archer does perform pretty solidly. So with a B in its accessibility, which is 3 points, an S in its functionality, which is a total 8 points, and then finishing off with 4 points, that puts it at 12. That puts it at pretty much near the top of A as far as like it's just under S. If it wasn't for the fact that it's pretty much mostly a martial archetype, I think I definitely think that the Eldritch Archer could have ascended up into an S rank archetype. It's really, really good, but it's just not as accessible as something like Archer would be. All right, next up is Eldritch Researcher, one of my favorites. I don't know, was it on my top 5 tier list for archetypes? I think it missed the mark for the top 5, my personal top 5 for archetypes, but it's definitely one of my favorites. Eldritch Researcher is essentially an archetype where your whole thing is you dive into the occult, you gain a bunch of abilities based on finding information. The core dedication itself is you get a bonus to your checks to attempt to identify things of magic using either arcana or occultism. And you gain some magical abilities with it. You do need to be trained in arcana and occultism, but that's really not that hard. So, starting out the gate, Eldritch Researcher is already looking at at least an A as far as its accessibility is concerned. As far as how many characters would take this one versus not, it's all based on, I think, the style of game you're going for. It has such a deep connection to either magic or occult stuff that if your game doesn't have very heavy elements of that, I think this wouldn't belong in a lot of campaigns. The the Outlaws of Alkenstar game, for instance, it might not overly play into that campaign. So I do think overall the Eldritch Researcher is just an A as far as its accessibility. Almost any class can get into it. I mean, most classes could. It's just 2 trained proficiencies, which you can easily pick up, especially as you're leveling up. This is a very big archetype, so there's actually a lot of feats that you can utilize and pick up, which I think gives it a lot more of a more people would want it. It's just because it's so tied to magic and occultism, it doesn't apply to necessarily everyone. So I'm going to give it an A as far as its accessibility. As far as its functionality is concerned, it's another top tier as far as if this is what you're going for, this is what you're going to be good at. Your ability to find information, I mean, Seeker of Truths allows you to pick up a domain initiate level feat for knowledge, secrecy, or truth. So you get a focus spell that allows you to help find secrets earlier. Once per day with Strange Script, you can touch a single text like a tome or whatever and be able to understand it. Scholarly Defense is not super great. Able Ritualist allows you to be better at doing rituals, which is a really good addition, and it very much makes it feel impactful. And let's see here. Know-It-All is a super good one. I think they also get, Incredible Recollection as well. Your character becomes the ultimate nerd as far as looking into the occult. You get a lot of cool abilities. This is a purely exploration style of archetype, not a lot of combat ability, but despite that, I do absolutely love it, and I'm going to make it an S tier as far as functionality. If looking into the occult or magic related things is your modus operandi, is the style of character you want to do, the Eldritch Researcher is one of the best, if not the best, for that particular archetype of character. So that's going to be a solid S as far as its functionality. As far as fantasy fulfillment, it's honestly really good. The only thing I would have to say is because it doesn't have a lot of combat ability, a lot of it doesn't really apply. Scholarly Defense being one of the very few, but it only gives you resistance against melee attacks made by aberrations and oozes. That is still a function, and I do appreciate that, but kind of how similarly to Eldritch Archer that I just mentioned before, that it was mostly combat and it didn't really bleed into anything else, this kind of bleeds into mostly out of combat stuff. Regardless, I'm going to give it an A purely because Entities from Afar is such a stylistic style of feat. What it does is you can use the Summon Entity spell as an occult spell once per day. And rather than the normal summoning spells where you use it as as like a minion in battle, you can instead like get a aberration and ask it questions that kind of have the same effects of the Read Omen spell. After it answers all the questions, it then disappears. It's really good. I Entities from Afar and a lot of the other stuff. The only thing that keeps it from being S tier, and it's like A plus, right? The only thing that keeps it from being S tier as far as its fantasy fulfillment is there's just not a lot of combat abilities. So if during combat your whole Eldritch Researcher-ness doesn't really come through, except for maybe something like Scholarly Defense, but even then, that's a very narrow situation, so a very niche kind of situation. So I will say it's going to get an A in its overall fantasy fulfillment. But considering everything, with a in its availability, which is 4 points, an S in its function for what you're trying to do, which is 9 points total, and another 4 points an A in its fantasy fulfillment, Eldritch Researcher does make S rank with 13 points, putting it just at the bottom of S rank. And honestly, Eldritch Researcher, I think, is the bare minimum, or maybe Alter Ego, but like Eldritch Researcher is definitely a really good S tier level of archetype if that is the kind of archetype you want to go with. It adds so much to your character. The only thing it's missing is combat ability, but archetypes in general are not going to be able to add to every level of every level of gameplay. So bearing that in mind, it's really good at what it does. It's a S tier 100% exploration style archetype, and with everything else being A rank, it deserves to be at least at the bottom of the S tier. All right, next up is Elementalist. It's a class archetype. I think it's the first class archetype we've had on this tier list, if I'm not mistaken, and it's overall a really good one. So let's go ahead and just get into the rating. So availability, I have to give it a B. It's only for spellcasters. So martial characters, unless no, they can't even take it, even if they multi-class into something else. So it is only for casters, so it has to be a B, unfortunately. But as far as casters are concerned, if you want to go an elementalist route, it's the perfect archetype to go into. It gives you a whole unique spell list as well, which I'll mention a little bit later. But the elementalist overall, as far as like its availability, it's just for spellcasters, and it's only really for the arcane and primal spellcasters. It's not even for divine and occult. So actually, with that in mind, I gotta availability. Yeah, unfortunately, I gotta mark its availability actually at C tier, because not only is it caster only, but only casters that have access to the arcane or primal spell lists, which is really rough. So unfortunately, that's 2 points. Ooh, for its availability. It's just very particular. Not every character can select it. For functionality, on the almost opposite end of the spectrum, I'm going to mark it as an S. If you want to play an elementalist, you have to select it. Not only that, but with the variety of meta magics that you can kind of pick up, similar with like a dowsing spell, burning spell. They even give you access to a unique type of familiar, the elemental familiar, which really is the only way to get access to this particular kind of familiar. It's really good. It's so good, in fact, that I have to make it S tier, because if you're playing an elementalist, you want access to the elemental spell list. It's the only way. You have to take it. So it has to be S, which I think is well deserved. It's definitely playstyle defining, and it's just really good. It adds so much to your character just by selecting it. As far as fantasy fulfillment is concerned, I think I also have to rate it pretty high as well. I mean, Elemental Familiar is already a really good feat, and because you can get the Familiar and Enhanced Familiar's feats through this archetype as well, I mean, that is something that even outside of combat is a part of your character. They can have an Elemental Wisp or some variety of, familiar that really plays uniquely to your style character and would be a hard kind of familiar to imitate with any other playstyle. Not only that, but with all the meta magics that it has, metabolize element allowing you to essentially eat a spell and become quickened on your next action, water step allowing you to be able to walk on water and similar fluid surfaces. It's just super good as far as a fantasy. It plays in combat and out of combat. So for the first time today, and probably one of the few archetypes to really make it up to S as far as fantasy fulfillment, Elementalist for sure earns its place as a S tier as far as fantasy fulfillment. This is character defining. If you pick Elementalist, you can very easily roleplay and mechanically show your character off as being an Elementalist. And I think that's absolutely amazing. And so this one being one of the shorter ones that we've done, just because it's so kind of cut and dry style, Elementalist with a C in its availability, which is 2 points, an S in its functionality, which is 7 points total, and another S in its fantasy fulfillment, brings it all the way up to 12 points, actually making it one of the top archetypes of the A tier, which is surprising and proof that an archetype, even if it utterly fails like one of the categories, it can still be a top of the line style of archetype. And Elementalist, I 100% agree, belongs in the A tier. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about the Exorcist, which is another super flavorful archetype. The whole shtick is you're really good at dealing with spirits, and you gain some really good unique abilities through doing so that don't apply only to spirits. So while it's a more niche style archetype, I feel like it has a little bit more flexibility than most. and it is one of the premier dealing with spirits style archetypes. So, that in mind, availability. So, in order to become an exorcist, you just need to be trained in the occultism. Oh, you just need to be trained in occultism or religion, which means some classes just can get it, you know, right out. Well, not right out the gate. The minimum feat level to pick up Exorcist is level 4, which, due to how it works, it makes sense. It sucks that you can't pick it up at level 2, obviously, but the initial dedication feat gives you so much, it's understandable. Because it's also like a slightly higher one, that's something to take into consideration as well. And something about the Exorcist that I feel like some people might not realize is it's an archetype that very specifically requires you to use the spirit dwelling, which is an item that you get through the archetype, to use a lot of its abilities. Which means if you're a character who wields a two-handed weapon or two weapons, this is actually a really rough archetype to utilize. I'm sure there are ways around it for sure. And, you know, obviously with how some of the ability, it's not something that might always apply. But just because it makes it harder to wield two-handed weapons, and because the style of gameplay as well is, there are a good amount of abilities that I feel like you can utilize in and outside of combat. I think a lot of classes might want to pick it up. They even have feats like blind fight, which allow you to fight invisible opponents more easily. There's a lot of good functionality in it. The one-handedness is a little bit rough, and I don't know. Obviously, yeah, even another thing to think about as well is most of the feats aren't even like directly targeted at them. Obviously, something like spiritual sense is. Things like sense evil, or many of the dwelling based abilities like spirits anguish or spirits absolution are not spirit focused. Now, in order to get a remnant rather than a spirit or a wisp, whatever it's called, you do need to fight ghosts. And so if you're not finding any ghosts or entities, this archetype is not living up 100% to its full capacity. So I think with that in mind, I'm going to mark it as a B. It's really good. I think a lot of classes would want this, but if you're not dealing with spirits per se, it loses some of its potency. That being the case, it still has good potency, even if you're in a campaign completely bereft of any style of spiritual like interference. So I do think it belongs B rank as far as its overall accessibility. Functionality. This is a very interesting aspect to it. You would select this archetype to play an exorcist, but in all honesty, a lot of the abilities are not focused around dealing with spirits. The initial ability that you get just allows you to gain resistance to either positive or negative damage. Cast out is just an attack that you can use. Oh, well, cast out, never mind. Cast out is allows you to get rid of spirits, which is good, which does play to it. But Spirit's Absolution is like a healing ability. Spirit's Anguish is a cone ability that gives the ability to do sonic damage based on a basic will save. Spiritual Sense can be good. Blind Fight. I mean, yeah, you know what? I think it does a lot of those things well. I think if you want to play an Exorcist, I feel like it just could have been more. I think there could have been more abilities specifically against spirits itself, rather than detecting or being able to handle spirits better. But a lot of the, it has a lot of functionality, whether it's healing yourself, whether it's dealing some damage. It does require one hand to hold the spirit vessel, but there's a lot of good feats intermixed into it. I'm going to say, for functionality's purpose, I want to put it at an A or a B. I might place at A because, no, I think I want to place it at B. You get lots of good abilities to deal with spirits, but nothing that handles like fighting the spirit itself necessarily. You can oust them from protection. You can sense them. You can even see them to a sense with blind fight. but there's no like direct to you ghost abilities. It requires a hand to utilize. And unless you're in a campaign that is fighting with undead or spirits specifically, the abilities do lose some of their potency. So I think just due to all those kind of accumulating factors of it has so much potential, and I think in the right campaigns, it's an A. So I'll mark it like a B plus, right? If you're in the right campaign, it's an A. If you're not in the right campaign, it's a B, which is still really good, but not as good as it could be. So that's already a B as far as its its accessibility, and a B in function. But let's talk about its fantasy fulfillment. And this is something that I do really like. The spirit dwelling item that you get from it is super flavorful. It can be a variety of things. It doesn't have to be any specific type of object, just a small object that can fit in your hand. So that can have a lot of narrative purpose for your character. This has in combat and outside of combat abilities, whether it's sensing spirits, whether it's, blind fight, whether it's the ability that when you use a spirit, but it's like a haunt spirit that kind of like you need to get rid of its anchor essentially to get rid of, you get a clue towards that. This is super flavorful, 100% flavorful, in fact, as far as its overall fantasy fulfillment. You take this, you become an exorcist. You have so many good abilities and so many things that I feel like would make it very interesting for your character and could potentially be fantasy fulfillment, or very character defining is what I was trying to say. I would say overall it's maybe is not as character defining as maybe some of the other archetypes that got S tiers, but I would make it like a bottom of S, top of A. I think both could be argued, and I don't think it makes that much difference in the overall scoring. I'll mark it as an S as far as fantasy fulfillment. You take it, there's so much narrative in game and out of game that you can really apply this to, and I think it's really, really good. So, that being the case, with a B in its accessibility, a B in its functionality, which is 6 points in total, and then an S in its overall fantasy fulfillment, I do think that puts it squarely in A. It puts it at minimum in the middle of A, or at I guess at this point in the middle of A. It, even if you were to mark its fantasy fulfillment A, that would make it a total of 10 points, which I think would be fair, but that would still put it at the bottom of A. So it's either mid to bottom A, bottom to mid A, which is still pretty good and a very, very solid archetype overall. All right, moving on to Familiar Master. Familiar Master is a surprisingly not diverse, but it's a surprisingly good archetype for the fact that all it really does is give you a familiar and make it more powerful. The overall purpose of Familiar Master is literally you get a familiar and you can have a really good familiar, and if you're using bonus archetype, or even if you're not, your familiar would be competitive, even with familiars like the Witch Familiar, which would get some of its own more unique style feats. But obviously with Familiar Master, there's some unique feats in Familiar Master that Witch wouldn't get access to either. So being a whole archetype that's competitive with a core feature from one of the classes is very solid. So overall, let's look at its overall availability. There is no requirements to pick it up, and you can pick it up as early as level 2. And it either gives you a familiar, or if you're a class that already has a familiar, you gain the enhanced familiar feat, which I think is brilliant. I think it's really good. It means anyone can select this and get a lot of benefit out of this. If you're a character who wants a familiar, this is really easy to do. And with all the feats that you gain access to, it's overall solid. So I think as far as availability, well, let's take a familiar as a gameplay thing itself, right? How many people would want a familiar versus not want a familiar? I think familiars are really good. I think if you understand how familiars work, they can aid you in many different ways. They mostly benefit spellcasters, alchemists a little bit, And then they do have some skill features that you can use to help your character with non-combat based stuff. So if you're a martial character who would want to, who has some skills outside of combat, it'd be good. But if you are a martial character in combat, I don't think the familiar has a lot to offer you. And so my gut instinct was to make it an S as far as availability. But just because a pure martial fighter character would not get as much benefit as, say, like an alchemist or a spellcaster, who do get some combat level benefits from having a familiar, I don't think it's 100% like an S. I think it's a high A. I think if you're a caster, it's like an S. But as far as like availability is concerned, not everyone needs a familiar. Not every class can really even benefit a ton from a familiar. A familiar is really good at assisting you, with outside of combat things and with some in combat things for some of the classes. So unfortunately, I don't think it's an S. I think it's a high A, a very high A. So if I could, I give it 4.5 points, A plus rank as far as its overall availability. Functionality. If you want a familiar, this is the familiar archetype. There's nothing else. It gives you a familiar. The familiar can be really good. If you already have a familiar, it makes your familiar better. Familiar Conduit is a really good for spellcasters. Familiar Mascot allows you to give benefits of your familiar to your allies. So even a martial character who has a familiar who can't necessarily help them with combat stuff, you can load in some combat stuff and then familiar mascot it to some of your spellcasters to enhance them as well. As well as a lot of the other features. I mean, it's just the perfect, if you want a familiar, this is the feat to take. So I have to give it an S, because if you want a really good familiar, I guess you don't have to. Okay. Which gets it and everything like that. But like, if you're using bonus archetype, there's no reason not to take it, because you can pick up all the familiar feats you would have picked up with your class feats through bonus archetype. So yeah, I think I'm going to mark a very solid S as far as its functionality. The functionality being, give me a familiar. You get a really good familiar through it, and I don't know. If you want a familiar, this is the archetype to take. All right, fantasy fulfillment. This is actually an interesting thing. Familiar mascot, I think, has some narrative flair to it, where your familiar is aiding everyone on the team and has some good team binding aspects. Other than that, it's just getting a familiar. And while getting a familiar might be character defining for some characters, especially if you're playing a class that doesn't normally get a familiar, it's not a super rare thing, even in the setting in the world. So it's not like it's super character defining. And not only that, but there's actually more character defining familiar feats in, say, like Elementalist, that gives you a very unique familiar. In fact, a more unique familiar than you could pick up through this, unless we're talking about, specific familiars, which this does make getting specific familiars easier. But I have to say that it is not any more character defining than if you just picked up a familiar feat normally through your class. So that being the case, I'm torn between A or B. A, I'm going to mark it a B. It doesn't give you super unique familiar types. It can help you get a specific familiar more easily, but I mean, I don't know. It's just like, if you're a witch, a familiar is kind of already a part of your thing. And so competing with witches, having the familiar master just kind of makes you an off-brand witch in a way. So I think I'll mark it as a B overall. It can be really good. It can be really good for your narrative stuff. I like familiar mascot. I think, if anything, familiar mascot could bump it up to an A, but I think it's closer to a B, actually. So with an overall availability of A for 4 points, a functionality of S for 5 points, so a total of 9, and a a fantasy fulfillment of B, which I'm a little surprised at, of 3 points, that puts it at 12, which puts it very comfortably in the middle of the A tier, which, I mean, if you can't tell, Pathfinder's really good at balancing everything, and these are all good based on what you're looking for. Obviously, this tier list is if you're looking for a particular niche or style of play and an archetype can enhance that, this is the way to go. This is not a general, like, put it on any kind of character tier list, because honestly, not every archetype even works with every class, first of all, as we saw with the Elementalist, and yet Elementalist I still think is a very stellar, archetype that belongs in the A tier. So I think Familiar Master is really good A tier. I mean, it's the premier familiar style archetype. So, And this tier list does have some Bs and some Cs as well. But obviously, since the game is so well balanced, it's going to have a lot of A's. It's going to have a lot of archetypes that work really well for the playstyle that you're going for when you select them. All right. We've come to Firebrand Braggart. If you watched my video, I'm sure you know a little bit of my feelings on the Firebrand Braggart. But let's just get into it, and I'll kind of spell it out. So, overall accessibility. It is a little bit more difficult. This is an uncommon archetype, and it requires you to be a member of the Firebrands. It also requires that you have a charisma of 14. So, unless your character concept is being a Firebrand, and you're trying to go into charisma, which, to be fair, if you would select Firebrand Braggart, this would be the way to do it. Or at least charisma would be the stat to take. Overall, I can't mark it more than a B, and it's very tempting to make it a C. I mean, because of its organization-specific requirements. Granted, it's not like a GM couldn't allow you to bypass that, where you learn the lessons, from a braggart, but you don't actually become a member of the Firebrands. It does circumvent it a bit, but I mean, like, access in that way is just, it's all dependent on the GM. So I can't knock it too much for, like, the Firebrand braggart. The only thing is when you take that and consider what the braggart does and what it adds to your character, which is you become kind of annoying. And your whole purpose is to challenge people by upstaging them, and then just it doesn't so the whole point of the Firebrand Braggart is you make difficult checks, and in turn gain bonuses. The boast, for instance, action allows you to, when you see someone do an action, you can attempt the same action at a penalty to get a bonus. But if you fail, you get a penalty for an hour. But if you succeed, you only get a bonus for 10 minutes, which is annoying. The Boaster's Challenge, Daring Act, some of the other abilities as well, none of them force enemies to actually attack you. It's just all about, like, it's a very treading the edge, going to the bleeding edge of, like, pushing yourself, giving your chance a huge chance to fail for only marginal successful benefits. I don't know. I don't think a class would select this unless they're very specifically trying to be a Firebrand in the first place. So, you know what? I'm going to mark its overall accessibility as a C. I don't see a lot of characters selecting this unless you're a Firebrand, which is very niche and very situational. Access not included, it also has a charisma requirement, so, obviously that would be I don't know. For a lot of the things that it does, I gotta mark it as a C. I think this is a very, very specific type of familiar that only very specific types of characters will select. So I gotta mark it as a C. Functionality. Oh boy. As I mentioned before, you take huge risks that can kind of mess you up in the long run. And instead, you can gain a small bonus if you manage to succeed a check that you're taking at disadvantage. Now, things like Boaster's Challenge is really good. It allows you to make a deception, diplomacy, or intimidation against the enemy's will DC. And if you succeed, you get a status bonus to your damage or to your weapon rolls or unarmed strikes against that foe until the end of your next turn. Daring Act allows you to make enemies more flat-footed. Bravo's Determination allows you to avoid going down. I think there's some good things in here, but the boast, greater boast, and whatever just don't work that well. There's some good combat benefits. I don't know. I will say that you could finagle this to work really well in your favor. Just the damage bonuses alone could be really good, making enemies flat-footed. So I say it's a pretty all-right archetype for its overall functionality. I don't know what the exact purpose of this archetype is, other than just to give yourself bonuses at the risk of, like penalties and such like that. And it doesn't really play in any one fashion. You can do some more damage, you can get better at certain skill checks, but you don't force the enemies to do anything. It doesn't force a particular play style. So I'm going to mark it as a B overall. I think there are some good feats in here. I think anything that's not the boast is really good. Boaster's Challenge, which is not the boast, it's a different thing. Boaster's Challenge is really good. Daring Act allows you to make an enemy flat-footed and allows you to get some maneuverability. Bravo's Determination allows you to avoid going down, which is really good. All of these of which are really good, but I don't think it really pushes it very specifically in a direction to the point that you would want to select this archetype. So I'm going to give it a B overall for its functionality. For fantasy fulfillment, I guess I'll make it an A, because the whole purpose is your character's a daredevil. Your character has to go out of their way to like use skills that an enemy did at a huge disadvantage to possibly get a benefit. And you're bouncing around the enemy, you're challenging them, flustering them. Like, there's a lot of good flair to it. So I can't knock it overall for the style that it brings. And if you are a Firebrand, obviously, this is really good. So I'm going to mark it as an A overall without getting overly into like the implications of what an A would be. I do think it has good flair. I do think it has more flavor than, say, the Bounty Hunter or even the Bastion. I mean, they're very cookie cutter. So I do think it's better than those as far as its overall flair. So I'm going to give it an A as far as its fantasy fulfillment. You are a daredevil. You have to do daredevilish things in with the feats to make it work. So inherently, it's good. And outside of combat, actually, is there any outside of combat abilities? I didn't even think about that. Let's see. The only thing I can think of is the boasts. Yeah. The boast and greater boast can play to that. So that does give it, I'll give it an A. I think an A is fair. You might disagree with me. You might make it a B. That might change the score, actually. Let's do the math and let's see if it's even worth, like, contemplating. So, accessibility, C, 2 points. Rough. Overall functionality, B. Not great, not bad. That's 3 points. That gives it 5. And then giving it, and then 4 points, A, for its overall fantasy fulfillment, puts it at the top of B tier, which you could argue it's a middle B tier, but it doesn't change the overall tier that the Firebrand braggart goes to. So, oh no, you can't see any of the other stuff. 1 second, I gotta readjust this now. Okay. Oh, it got a little smaller, but tier list is getting bigger. So, anyway. Firebrand braggart, middle B, somewhere in the B. I think it belongs in B. I don't think it's a C. I don't think it's as bad as Bullet Dancer or Corpse Tender, but it's definitely not one of my favorite. If it's like personal choice, I'd make it like a C, but I do think it has at least some place in the game. All right, next up, we're looking at Fireworks Technician, which is a surprising diamond in the rough as far as I'm concerned. It's a really good archetype overall. I enjoyed it. The whole purpose is you're a character who essentially gets fireworks and can use them in combat, and I guess outside of combat. It's mostly a combat archetype to do a variety of things. It kind of gives you a kind of an alchemisty kind of feel or inventory kind of feel. You get a bunch of little gadgets you can throw out in combat. It's really fun. The fireworks are really good, and I do think a lot of them work very well. You even essentially get a fireball that you can use with this archetype, which I think is really cool. So let's talk about its overall availability, shall we? So fireworks technician availability. You do need to be trained in crafting, which is not bad. It's technically an uncommon archetype, but that's just because gunpowder is rare in the setting. I don't think that's any mark against it. My only complaint would be that to get expert fireworks crafter, you need to be expert in crafting, and expert proficiencies can be, a little harder to come by for some classes. I don't think that's a very big knock overall. But another thing to consider with the fireworks technician as well is there's a lot of action economy that kind of goes with it when it's like pulling out using the fireworks. A lot of them can be, I wonder if, let's see here. Yeah, a lot of them do require that you have a hand free to activate, which means if you're a two-handed weapon wielder, this is a harder archetype to implement into your playstyle, making it more difficult for martials. I do think a lot of characters would select this though, because there's a lot of good abilities, and I think there's some flexibility with it. I will say, due to making it less against or harder for some martials, I guess not all, especially if you're like a bow user. I even consider bow users, honestly. I don't know. Just because it's not for two-handed weapon wielders, I would mark it down from S. The expert crafting, I mean, if you're going for a character like this, obviously, sure. I think A or B is very legitimate for this one as far as accessibility is concerned. You have to want to do crafting to get the expert fireworks crafting stuff. You get fireworks lore, which is interesting. But the one-handed, like the necessity for one-handing makes it a little rougher. So I think just because it is hard, because obviously you want your character to be using as much as possible, and having a character that's not using something in their hand is harder for a martial than it is a spellcaster. So I think I'm just because of that, because it requires a free hand, I got to mark it as a B as far as its overall accessibility, which is a bit of a shame, but understandable. So talking about its functionality, I think it's really good. You become a really good gadget style character. You get a bunch of fireworks. You start off with 3 fireworks, and as you pick up more feats, you get access to more. It gives you a bunch of infused reagents so that you can use these without a specific cost. I think it really adds to the playstyle overall, and a lot of the effects are really good. Is it S tier? Is it the same as Archer? No, I don't think I'd put it up as Archer. So I think I'm going to make it an A. The Fireworks Technician is really good, and I think it does have a lot to offer as far as what it offers in combat. And even though there's not a lot of not out of combat uses, there are still some. I mean, you're creating explosions, good for distractions, good for all kinds of things. I think it has a very good amount of functionality and can be used in a wide variety of situations. So with Fireworks Technician, I'm going to mark it up, or I'm going to mark the functionality as an A. It's really good. It's really good at what it does. It has good combat ability. It's not DPS focused, but it's not support focused. So I think A is really good. I think B could also potentially be argued. So fantasy fulfillment, last tier. Really good. I think your character's uniqueness with their use of fireworks in and outside of combat can be very character defining, can be a big element of a character. I do think there's a lot of things it can do, but obviously fireworks aren't necessary in all situations. And if you're stealthing or I didn't even think about that. Yeah, fireworks don't work if you're stealthing or trying to be quiet. You know what? I will mark down its functionality down to a B. Now I think about it. The loud poppiness. There's a lot of situations where that might be more of a hindrance, and for combat abilities. I mean, like a fireball is loud too, I guess, but a wizard could have quieter spells, but fireworks are all like explosions. Even though it doesn't necessarily state it, I'll mark it as a B. I think that there's some stuff. And as far as fantasy fulfillment, I do think it's potentially character fulfillment. I do think that it is very defining for a character. There might be some settings where it's not as good, but I do think it's very solid. I don't think it's an S. I think it's an A, potentially a B, but I do really like it. I like a lot of what it offers, a lot of the functionality. If you're not stealthing, obviously it can be really good. And I think it does give a good flair. So I think if you pick it up, this could be character defining. So I think I'll give it an A. So with a B, as far as its accessibility, which is 3 points, a B as far as its functionality, which could be argued an A, which is 6 points, and then an A for its overall like fantasy fulfillment, what adds to your character. It's a bottom of A archetype, which I think is fair. I do think the functionality is really good. I think it could be argued down to a B, honestly, and definitely in some situations, but I do like it, and I do like what it adds. Mechanically, it changes your playstyle as well, which is really good. And there's a lot of the fireworks are just a single action. So this could be really good in intermixing with your playstyle overall. So yeah, I definitely think A is where Fireworks Technician belongs. And I think Fireworks Technician is a gatekeeper for anything below it. You have to be better than Fireworks Technician to get up into A, and I think that's very fair. Fireworks Technician is really good at what it does, and even outside of combat, there's a lot of things you can do to kind of enhance your character feel and the role playness and everything. So I do like it a lot. All right, next up is Flexible Spellcaster. This is a very interesting one, and it's playstyle defining, but I don't think it's gonna do well, honestly. But let's get into it. So overall availability, it is specifically for prepared spellcasters. It can be used on marshals. It can't be used on spontaneous spellcasters. So being a niche of a niche, it's got to be a C. It's very particular for a very particular subset of classes, and some classes it doesn't even apply to. So, I think a C is fair. I think for the characters that I'd want to, I think is more of like a 50-50 whether you like how prepared casting works versus not. I think for a lot of people it's a godsend and others not. So I think C is fair. Overall functionality. Its functionality is you turn from from a prepared spellcaster to more of a spontaneous spellcaster at the cost of a spell slot per spell level. That being the case, it's a trade-off, right? It's an equal split. You are trading spell slots to have more flexibility with them. I think that's fair, but overall you are losing a part. You're losing the total functionality of your class. You're able to do less things in a day because you would rather play a spontaneous caster rather than a prepared one, which I think is very weird. Flexible Spellcaster also has no other feats, which is a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because it means you don't need to select any other feats. You just pick this up at level 1, select the archetype at level 2, and you're good to go, and you can pick any other archetypes. But there's nothing else, so I don't think it really offers too much. But this is something that is really good for a person who just doesn't like prepared spellcasting but really loves something like the Witch or the Wizard, which I think is completely understandable. So as far as functionality is concerned, I'm going to give it a B. It's a trade-off. It's a straight split. You don't get anything extra really from selecting this. It just changes your playstyle. So because it doesn't add anything like most archetypes does, it's not really anything I would say is very fantastic, but because it can change your whole playstyle, I think it still is a valid archetype choice. So I'm going to give it a B as far as its overall functionality. And overall fantasy fulfillment. Let's look at it this way. It doesn't change anything else. You still write spells in your spellbook if you're a wizard, or stuff scrolls into your familiar if you're a witch. The only difference is you prepare your spell slightly differently than those classes, which I think is potentially character defining, but because this is only for certain kinds of casters, and for like divine and like druid, it's even stranger because like it's not like it's a different theorem. It's just your god giving you powers in a slightly different way. I'm going to give it a B. It's okay. I think that there are some role play elements you can add in with it, but it does take away from your character's overall. Like you can have less utility spells because of it, even though I think functionally you can get more utility out of it. And I think it's hard to really accurately show what it's doing as like a narrative device. So I'm going to say it's a C. It's not a D because I don't think it doesn't change anything about your character. But I think beyond just like justifying how your character does something differently than other characters, it's not that character defining and mechanically doesn't add anything to how your character does things. It just changes how your spell lists work, essentially. So I think it can be argued to be, but I think a C is what I'll rank its overall fantasy fulfillment. So a really low ranking one, probably one of the lowest for today. Flexible spellcaster as overall availability gets a C, which is 2 points. For overall functionality is a B, a very neutral. So total of 5 points, and another B as far as, another C as fantasy fulfillment, giving it 7 points, which puts it right at the bottom of the B tier list, which I don't think it's worse than Firebrand Braggart overall. So I don't think it belongs in C. But if you were to let's see, did that math out right? 2, 3, 2, 7. Yeah. So I would have had to. Yeah, that makes sense. So overall, it's good. I think it works. It's bottom of B tier because it just changes your playstyle. That's it. It doesn't add much to your character. It just changes your playstyle, which is valid and I think belongs in B. Not as bad as Bullet Dancer. Not as bad as Corpse Tender. Yeah, definitely a B. All right, last but not least, Folklorist. And Folklorist was another surprising archetype, even though I think I kind of knew generally of the power of the archetype itself. So let's go ahead and look at its availability, shall we? All you need to do is be trained in performance. Really good. A lot of its features are either based on using recall knowledge or sustaining an action every round. Because you have to restrain, or you have to sustain an action, you have to spin tail, and you can only spin tail once per 10 minutes, right? Yeah, once every 10 minutes. So essentially once per combat. Once you stop sustaining it, the effect ends. And because it requires an action, some classes or playstyles might not really want to select this one. So I think it's a really good archetype overall, and I think a lot of classes could like it, but I think there's some very specific classes like Gunslinger, like Magus, that really specifically won't take this because they're already super action heavy. So I'm going to mark it as an A as far as its overall availability. It's also an uncommon one because it comes from a module, but I do think that if you want to add a good support twists to your overall fights, it's really good, and it's a really good, I think that there's enough reason to take Folklorist here to enhance your character to make people want to select it. So I'm going to give it an A as far as its overall accessibility. Functionality, it's good. It gives you essentially the same kind of benefits that a Bard's Inspire Courage does. And you can take this on almost any class. I mean, you can't take this on any class, but, some classes wouldn't want to use it. So for the same kind of benefits, granted to a single teammate that gives the same effects as essentially Inspire Courage, really good. Now, the fact that you can only do it once per 10 minutes, and it requires you to sustain it. So once you stop sustaining it, for whatever reason, it's done. So if you go unconscious, you can't do anything with it anymore. And a lot of its other features don't work when you're not sustaining it. I'm going to have to make the functionality a B, despite it being one of the best support archetypes in the game. Only because the action reliance makes it difficult and can be restraining for your playstyle. And if something stops you from performing it for whatever reason, say if you get silenced or anything because it's an auditory effect, there's nothing else. It just ends and it's gone for the rest of combat. Now, its recall knowledge is really good. It has a universal recall knowledge, which is super good outside of combat, but that's literally like the only outside of combat thing it gets. I do think it's a B. I would probably personally rate it more like an A, but because of sustaining an action, because when it falls off, it stays off, and because of the recall knowledge thing and how good it is, I think the recall knowledge thing could bump it to an A, but I'm going to have to mark it down purely because that once the effect falls off, you just can't do anything with it anymore in combat. And for an especially in long combat, that's just a lot of combat feats potentially funneled into this that are not being used, which is really rough. So unfortunately, it's got to be a B. I will state it's still one of the best support archetypes in the game. And fantasy fulfillment. Oh, this one has so much flavor. The fact that when you're telling the story, it produces magical illusions that enhance the story is really good. The call off effect at level, I think, 12, where level 10, Commune Tale, where one, you can do your whole team. Oh, the whole team part. The functionality is still a B, but it's so good, so good. The fact that your allies can assist by doing their own call out means that it has a lot of like narrative, like moments where your teammates can add to the story. And it's all about creating a story. It's literally about creating a story. It manifests things in game that enhance the story. I think it's overall good. There's not a lot of, let's say, out of combat stuff besides the recall knowledge stuff, which is there. I think it's an A plus. I think it's an A plus for its overall fantasy fulfillment. I don't think it's as character defining necessarily as like maybe Alter Ego, which can actually change your character's mannerisms, or Clockwork Reanimator, where you have like a constant companion following around. But your character can have the element of your narrative storyteller, and it's like a part of the character. I just don't think it's as character defining as like some of the other S tier character defining ones. So I'll mark it an A plus overall. Potentially, a half a point if that would make any difference, which I know it won't. So overall, availability A, 4 points. Functionality B, 3 points for 7. And then a 4.5, A plus for its fantasy fulfillment for 11.5, potentially 12, making it A towards the top of A, which I think is absolutely warranted. Folklorist is a really good archetype overall, and one I would highly recommend you to take a look in if you want to give your character a kind of supportive twist and a really good narrative like skin for your character as well. And that's it. A list got bigger, B list got bigger, no C's were added. We added one more to S, which I mean is pretty fair. Typically we add 1 to 2. So far we've added 2 per list, but this one was slightly smaller than the other one. So adding only 1 I think was fair for the S tier. And overall, I think this is a good list. I think it's fair. Obviously, if you probably skip to the end just to see where these all are at, then you have no way of knowing what I feel on these exactly. But hopefully I was able to describe my feelings about these as well as I could to a lot of you and kind of my purposes. I do love that Pathfinder is like a very A-weighted archetype list. It makes a lot of the archetypes feel like they're really good. Every archetype in the A tier, I would take on the character. And in B tier, I would maybe take, besides Bastion, because Bastion is an absolute like gem. It's so good. If it wasn't, it only ranks so low because it's only if you're armor wearing character, which I mean is fair. But Bastion, I would definitely take on a lot of characters, a lot more characters for sure. But B would be some characters, and C would be, I would struggle to select them. And there's no D, so that means there's no archetype so far that I feel that you just should never select whatsoever. And an S, honestly, a lot of good ones. I would select more from A than S in general. but that's, I don't know. S is, I think, a really good tier list as far as like overall blend of functionality and such. But I think A is just a really good list, and I'd play almost everything in A easily on a character of mine. So I think this did well. But hey, tell me your opinions in the comments. I know you'll do so anyway, so no point in me, even really pointing it out. And if you all like this, subscribe so you can see more content like this. We're pushing this channel up to 3K. Probably be at 3K in the next couple months and further beyond by the end of this year. Anyway, that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me. And I'll see you all next time. Bye.